So let's get started. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's panel on the future of food costs and supply chain issues. My name is Stephen Redding. I'm co-director of the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies, jointly with Ilyana Kuzienko. As you all know, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a general increase in the rate of inflation in many countries, including the United States, with increased spending on consumer durables interacting with the disruption of global supply chains in the aftermath of the pandemic. And that's led to growing price pressures for, in particular, producer durables, but also other goods and services. At the same time, increased labor demand has coincided with some withdrawal from the labor market during the pandemic, and that's led to increased pressure in the labor market, exerting further upward pressure on prices. Furthermore, in some countries, the introduction of more protectionist trade policies, such as the tariffs first introduced by the Trump administration, and other events such as Brexit in the United Kingdom, have put further upward pressure on consumer prices. And that sort of shock to the trade policy environment, combined with the even larger shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, have led to a lot of debate about the resiliency of supply chains and when and whether to offshore, reshore, or friendshore different stages of productions. And then finally, the heart of the debate during today's webinar, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has provided a further large-scale shock, in particular to energy supplies, most especially natural gas in Europe, but then also importantly to supplies of cereal grains, and just as importantly, to inputs used in food production, such as fertilizers. And as a result of that shock, prices for both oil and cereals rose sharply in the initial stages of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Although more recently, both oil prices and grain prices have fallen quite substantially back towards levels where they began at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And of course, that's in part due, but not only due, but in part due to the resumption of grain exports from Ukraine. But that remains under considerable uncertainty as to the extent to which that's going to remain feasible, and then more generally about future medium-term supplies of grain from that part of the globe. And then, of course, in the longer term, against the backdrop of all of those short-term and medium-run events, we have the long-run phenomenon of climate change, an increased frequency of extreme weather events, whether that be drought and water shortage, as in the southwest of the United States, or intense storms and flooding, such as the recent tragic flooding in Pakistan. And so those longer term issues of supply chain raise bigger long-run questions about the stability of our current supply chains in the agricultural sector and how those are going to need to reorganize themselves over the coming decades. And so we have a stellar panel assembled this afternoon to debate this wide-ranging set of issues, including Joseph Glauber, Senior Research Fellow of the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Megan Greene, Senior Fellow of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, and Máximo Cullen, Chief Economist, Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And each of them is going to bring a different perspective to speak to this issue of the cost of food and supply chain uncertainty, in particular in the agricultural sector. I think each speaker is going to aim to talk for around 15 to 20 minutes, proceeding in alphabetical order based on last name. And then that'll leave a little time towards the end for discussion and Q&A at the end of the webinar. And so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A in Zoom, and then I can read out your questions to our panelists towards the end in the discussion part of the webinar. And so I'm really looking forward to an exciting discussion about these sort of really fundamental issues, particularly important not just in developed countries, but also especially in developing countries, many developing countries around the world, which may be less resilient in some ways to weather some of these extreme short-run, medium-run, and long-term shocks. So a fascinating set of issues. And so I'm going to hand over to our first speaker now, Joseph Glauber. Joseph, it's over to you. So please feel free to share your screen.
Sure. So thanks. And I presume I'm in full presentation mode now?
Yes, that looks fantastic.
Great. Okay. After all the problems. Okay. So Steve, great introduction. I think this is an issue, particularly what's been going on with the war in Ukraine and its impact on agricultural markets and things like poverty and other things around the world. Certainly has been occupying a lot of my time and my colleagues' time at the International Food Policy Research Institute. I thought for this exercise, I was going to, or for this event, I'm going to talk a little longer term, because I think one of the things that we have been very much involved with is monitoring agricultural markets. My own background, I spent 30 years at the Department of Agriculture, where I was chief economist or deputy chief economist for about 20 or so of those years. And one of the responsibilities there was to oversee USDA's monitoring of agricultural markets, putting out monthly reports and forecasts. Since that time, I've been very much involved, as has Máximo, since 2011, with something called the Agricultural Market Information System, which is a G20 creation of a group of international organizations and G20 members and large non-G20 members, agricultural producers, that get together on a periodic basis and put out market information in a monthly format and other things. And so I want to talk a little about the challenges of that. I know it's so let me, okay, our first, let's see if I can get this thing to go. Okay, so this is a typical thing of some of the analysis that we've been doing at IFPRI, and that is looking at vulnerabilities given the conflict in Ukraine. And so we've been looking at countries that have been directly impacted with direct exposure to the Black Sea supplies coming out of both Russia and Ukraine, looking at countries with high import dependencies, because these are obviously a global phenomena. So we're seeing high prices for many countries. There's a lot of macro issues going on. And you mentioned fertilizer import dependencies and other things. Russia and Belarus are very, very large producers and exporters of fertilizers in the markets. And then lastly, how that affects local food markets. And so these are parts of the things that we look at IFPRI. But I'm going to talk about, again, these monitoring systems. One, I'm going to look at very quickly what is many consider the gold standard, that is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's market analysis system. You know, USDA was created in 1862. The primary goal of USDA at the time was, you know, essentially technology, handing out seeds and things to farmers, but also providing market information. And they have done that since the 1860s. You can, oops. Sorry, the actual situation outlook program began in the 1920s. It went pretty well. You know, they produced a lot of reports up until the 1970s, and then we had this large sale of grain to the Russians. Russia came into the market after almost importing virtually nothing throughout the 50s and 60s. In 1972, they came in and bought over 15 million tons of wheat. That was around 25% of the global wheat market. Prices skyrocketed. That sent inflation rates around the world. You know, we saw record high nominal prices, at least for wheat and other grains. Food and price inflation, you know, we were talking about how high it is in the US right now, 13.5% year over year price changes for food at home. Back in 1973, following this big grain deal, they were up in the 23%. So incredible impacts. And what everyone was surprised at is that there was this surprise that we had no forewarning of it, because USDA at the time, there were conflicting views in USDA in terms of what was going to happen. And that precipitated a big effort to coordinate the analysis across the department. And so what was created and that later was named the World Agricultural Outlook Board is something that coordinates information from all the major information agencies within USDA, including the Statistics Service, Foreign Agricultural Service, Economic Research Service, a number of the administrative program agencies that collect administrative data, and then a weather facility that also operates within USDA. Most of that was all in my old office of the chief economist in terms of the World Agricultural Outlook Board and the weather facility. And so from that, they put out a monthly report that's closely watched around the world in terms of what, again, covering many commodities in terms of what the current forecasts are. And again, as I say, it's considered by many to be sort of the gold standard. It's very labor intensive because a lot of it is on ground, at least in the US, survey work and other things. But let me switch to what I'm currently involved with, and that is the Agricultural Market Information System. This was launched in 2011. It was the French government, which was chairing the G20 at the time, decided to have a ministerial, an agricultural ministerial, looking at the price volatility in the agricultural markets. We had seen big price increases in 2007-8, again in 2010-11, and there were countries were putting on a lot of instituting a lot of policies like export restrictions and stockpiling programs and other things that were exacerbating price volatility. And it was decided that one thing that would help a lot is to have a focal point that could provide monitor supply and demand situations of the main food commodities. So wheat, maize, rice, and soybeans. In one sense, this augmented reporting by USDA and also by other entities like the International Grains Council, but added its own set of estimates. And it also did wanted to promote, the idea was that this could promote some policy coordination among the main producing and consuming countries of the crop. The way this is organized is you have the major G20 countries, including here the EU, so the G20 members of the EU are also represented by the EU in this meeting. And then some large countries were invited to join AMIS. These countries like Ukraine, which are major wheat producing countries, major corn producing countries, very important in vegetable oil markets, and so a number of the countries were added. AMIS has was again started in 2011. We also have a secretariat that is composed of a lot of major international organizations like FAO, the World Bank, IFPRI, the group I'm with, and then some private entities as well, or the non-international organizations, things like the International Grains Council, GeoGlam, which is a consortium of satellite consortium of universities and others who do Earth observation data. And these all participate in terms of helping produce these market monitors. It has steering committees, everything. I'm not going to bore you with the details for the organization. We do put out a market monitor, and I think these, this is now, I think we just put out our 100th one or whatever. So it's an ongoing thing. I think it's had a lot of good support within the G20 and elsewhere. And as I'll talk in a minute, we're now thinking of broadening some of the work we do. But I think there's a lot of challenges. I think on the production side, obviously Earth observation data has improved. USDA, the whole time, USDA has been using Landsat technologies and other things dating back to the 1970s, early 1980s, but that's improved clearly a lot over time. I think largely, when I was at USDA, it was used largely as indicators to say, here, there may be a problem in this country. We would send someone from USDA out to fields to sort of ground truth it. But now we're at a point now where at least GeoGlam, for example, is working with the Ukraine government to try to map plantings, to try to do a better job of yield estimations based on vegetative indices and other things. It's obviously less costly. We have countries like Canada and Australia now who are doing at least their first 2 or 3 surveys within the year are done by satellite. So I think there's a real real potential here that's getting better and better. And there's obviously a lot of private forecasters that are also in this space. Demand estimations is far more challenging in one sense. In some countries, developed countries in particular, we have good data on things like food and industrial use. You can draw on administrative data in some countries. We can get a pretty good handle on how things like wheat milling or some other variables, those tend to be a lot more easy to estimate rather than something like feed use, which is often done in backyards. We tend to try to do something with inference from number of animals, or oftentimes feed use just becomes a residual. And for a crop like maize, that's a huge issue. It's, you're talking 40 to 50% of total use for a crop going to livestock feed, yet we don't have, no one is really surveying what is used in by farms or feedlots or others. Trade is the other thing that we have actually good data on, because most countries do report through Comtrade, through the United Nations. But there too, we've seen some casualties. Russia, for example, quit reporting trade data. And so we don't have data beyond January. So that's been very difficult to track, for example, how much wheat is leaving the country these days, or how much fertilizer. So we end up trying to do that by using so-called mirror trade data, by looking at what countries are importing. But the other thing is, for countries like regions like sub-Saharan Africa, we just, the reported data is very small. It's just a tip of the iceberg relative to the informal trade and other things. So all these present issues. And then on top of it are stocks, and stocks are very, very key, obviously. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go really quickly here. But they're, again, very big challenge. And if so we use, as I say, a lot of the Earth observation data provided by GeoGlam to look at crop conditions throughout the world. These are updated monthly, and traced through for AMOS. But I think we have things like problems with countries that hold large stocks like China, but we just don't have very good data on them. They don't report the quantity of data, the quality of the quantity of stocks. The quality of stocks is very uneven, and many people think it's very poor. But you can see here that China, according to the data that's produced at least by USDA, you look and you think, well, it looks like there's a year's worth of inventory there for wheat that could potentially obviously help in a time like this. But the quality and the quantity is just, there's just so much uncertainty, and so much of it is, in China at least, is tied to price support programs, at least in the past. And these stocks are largely insulated from world markets. That is, they aren't exported. And so, but that makes a big difference. Here's just two graphs looking, one at global stocks, including China. And you can see there, it looks like stock levels have essentially trended up over time, which certainly runs counter to the fact that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen increases in world prices. Yet, if you look at the stocks excluding China, and these essentially are mainly stocks held by major exporters, those have declined. And there you can see that corn and wheat are at lowest levels, for the last 10 to 15 years. And that is certainly consistent with the prices that we have seen. So again, all this is a challenge. And I think AMOS, and I'll just conclude here, is trying to improve. There's interest in AMOS now adding vegetable oil analysis to the work that we do. Fertilizer analysis has been another big thing. We just had a webinar yesterday with a number of fertilizer analysts to discuss the global fertilizer situation. And I think more importantly is this sort of rapid response analytical capacity to coordinate with across the international organizations. The big challenge, frankly, is for something like this, which is essentially funded by donations from countries and organizations, is how do you do this at a period when that long stretch of prices when they're very low? There's just less interest. And says, yes, anytime there's we see prices in price spikes, a lot of people are interested in providing everyone's interested in improving market information, but when prices get low and that can continue for a long time, as we've seen, there's just a lot less interest there. So let me stop there and look forward to the comments.
Thanks, Joseph. That was terrific. Really, really interesting discussion there, and highlighting those really important issues of global supply of corn, wheat, and other key agricultural commodities. Fascinating data on stocks over time. And so now I think Megan's going to speak next. And so handing over to you, Megan.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me to come speak to you. I'm going to confess that I haven't been focused on food security as an economist for my entire career. I actually really only started looking into it in great detail earlier this year when I attended a talk that Janet Yellen was delivering at the Atlantic Council. And it was at a time when the Atlantic Council was announcing that they were launching a new initiative to look at the Bretton Woods institutions. And it really caught my ear that Janet Yellen spent a significant portion of that speech referencing the food crisis. And I thought that was interesting in the context of reforming Bretton Woods institutions, but also in and of itself, I thought it was really interesting that the US Treasury Secretary was looking into this. And of course, at the spring meetings, the IMF World Bank spring meetings, just after that, there were a number of kind of side closed door meetings among US and other officials looking into the food security crisis. So I thought I better look into it too. And I guess I want to set the scene a little bit in terms of kind of where we've been in the past year in particular with the food crisis, where it's been more recently, because food prices have been pretty volatile. And then also, some of the drivers of the food insecurity crisis that we're facing, and then also some kind of longer term measures to address it that I can sit here as an economist and say, but that are politically difficult nevertheless. So just to set the scene a little bit, I highlight this isn't at all a new problem, right? We had a food security crisis from 2008 to 2012, roughly. We had a whole bunch of social and political unrest off the back of it as well, which is an important reminder for us to think about now. But food prices had been rising already from the middle of 2020. So initially in the pandemic, they cratered as demand generally cratered, but then food prices were already up pretty significantly. So this was already a problem. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine, of course, it was aggravated significantly. And it was aggravated on a number of levels. We've kind of created this perfect storm between COVID and the war, whereby we've had a surge in demand in some cases as we've defrosted our economies following a deep freeze of them. We've also had all these supply chain issues off the back of that. We've had a bunch of climate disasters, I would say, and Stephen, you mentioned Pakistan earlier. That's the latest example, but there have been countless over the past couple of years. We don't know how to predict them with great accuracy, but we do know that they're coming more quickly. And then of course you've had a war on top of that. And so that all has pushed up food prices pretty significantly. Food inflation was 30% year on year in April. So food prices were on average, according to FAO, rising that much. According to the World Food Program, also according to FAO, food prices were 12% higher earlier this year than they were at the peak of the 2008-2012 food crisis. So if ever there were a time to take some lessons from that food crisis, now is certainly it. According to the IIF, 35 emerging and frontier markets are currently facing a major food crisis. That's a really challenging environment for a lot of these economies because they're providing food subsidies, food and energy subsidies, at a time when the dollar's strengthened considerably, rates are rising, and so they're having to not only pay for imports and commodities in their local currency with a stronger dollar, they're having to figure out how on earth they're going to continue to provide these subsidies in the face of ever rising food prices. So that's going to be incredibly challenging as well. What we have found is that ignoring these problems only makes them worse. So if you just kind of stick your head in the sand, they tend to get worse. The number one cause of food insecurity is conflict, of course, and so you can't ignore that. But also, you find that food insecurity is a huge driver of political unrest, social unrest, and forced migration. So this just gets more expensive the more we put off dealing with it. And so this is all pretty grim, but the good news is there is actually enough food to go around. So on average, we're producing enough calories, so 3,000 calories per person per day. And if you split it up between proteins and fats and carbohydrates, it's enough for humans to live on. So it isn't an overall global supply problem. It's a mismatch in terms of markets. And that suggests that maybe if we can make the markets a little bit more efficient, we might be able to address some of these crises. Stephen mentioned, though, now I highlighted some horrific figures in terms of food price inflation earlier this year, but of course, food prices have actually been abating pretty significantly over the past couple of months. And so I think it's probably taken some of the focus off of this issue. And I think that's probably wrong. But some of the reasons that food prices have abated include global recession fears. So most economists think that the US is going into a recession next year. Europe's probably going into a recession at the end of this year. And emerging markets may well go into recession, if not a sovereign debt crisis. And so that makes everybody expect that food prices will definitely abate. And so that takes some of the pressure off of them. Turkey and the UN brokered a deal between Russia and Ukraine on reopening Ukrainian ports. That was helpful, I think, certainly. But that deal was brokered actually after food prices started coming off in July. So that's a piece of it, but not the full story. There's been a bumper crop in Russia this year. So Russia, despite being at war, has managed, and despite facing sanctions, has managed to export a lot of grain. The Northern Hemisphere has had a pretty good harvest this year as well. And so what we've seen is that wheat futures in Chicago for December delivery are actually below the pre-war levels. Corn is also below or at pre-war prices. And palm oil those prices have fallen to below where they were in late February as well. So some prices for food have come down. Some certainly haven't. I'd highlight that a lot of these prices have come down in US dollars, but of course, even though this is transacted in US dollars, if you're importing this stuff, then you need even more local currency. And so it's coming down in US dollars. If the dollar is so much stronger, then countries like Turkey and Egypt are still in trouble. And also it's not just food prices, but it's also fertilizer prices that have been an issue. So they've jumped significantly. They've come, fertilizer prices are rising less quickly now, but they're still way up on where they were a year ago. And that's partly because energy costs are up so much. So natural gas is a huge input into fertilizer. And on top of that, delivering food is very energy intensive as well. So as long as energy costs are up significantly, food prices will be up too. And I don't see that abating anytime soon. I think energy costs globally are going to be pretty high for a while. So while food price inflation has abated somewhat, it's still a big problem. I still think we need to look at it. And so what can we do about food insecurity? It's a really tricky question, in part because food security is connected to other major issues, things like conflict and things like climate change. And so to some degree, if you're only looking at the food security piece, you're missing a lot of the other drivers and you can't really solve it, so to speak, unless you're addressing all these issues. Given that we live in a world with finite resources, and so policy is always a question of trade-offs, we can't just go ahead and solve climate change and solve food security and conflicts globally. That's preposterous. So, I wish I could offer that up as a possible solution, but it's not a reasonable one. So I do think that there are a few things we can do. One is that we've noticed that when there are issues of food insecurity, the international community doesn't respond to all of them in the same way. So we found that actually food aid is a pretty political process. And if you look at the numbers, we've mobilized a lot of support for Ukraine, for example. We also mobilized a lot of support for Yugoslavia when it was in war. So the international community is able to mobilize a lot of support, particularly when it deals with a very strategic or geostrategic region. And unfortunately, often when those who are affected look a lot like us. And so I think that support hasn't been mobilized in the so-called global South in the same way as it has in places like Ukraine and Yugoslavia. And so one way to address that might be to depoliticize the entire process a little bit. This is looking at, literature on automatic stabilizers. If you want there to be a quick response that isn't politicized, you try to create an automatic stabilizer where you have a trigger, and when that trigger's hit, something automatically happens. So if we could generate sort of automatic stabilizers globally for food insecurity, I think that would get aid out much faster and in a more judicious way. Now, what could those triggers be? I think they could be around food price inflation. For example, it could also be around the number of people who are estimated to be in food security. It could also be around natural disasters. So if there is a disaster with an impact of such, then we have to have this response in terms of food aid. So that's one option. One of the responses this time around, and unfortunately every time around when we have food price increases, is for exporters to go ahead and announce export bans. Most recently, we saw it in this crisis with India banning wheat exports. Indonesia announced that they were banning palm oil exports because palm oil is a substitute for sunflower oil, which there's a shortage of given Ukraine is such a big exporter of sunflower oil. And also China announced a ban on fertilizer. And so that's kept fertilizer prices up. And so one thing we could have is we could get the biggest food exporters around a table and have them agree that they aren't going to impose export bans, and have them publicly announce it. So have the US, Canada, EU, Argentina, and Brazil announce that they won't be engaging in export bans. That could help at least improve efficiency in the markets. We could also do something a little bit more fundamental and tinker with the WTO. The WTO was actually developed at a time when food prices were steadily falling. And so baked into the WTO rules are tools to kind of limit the countries' ability to engage in protectionism around imports, so they can limit imports, which lead to lower prices. But there's no real tools to do the opposite, to prevent countries from actually imposing export controls, limiting exports. And that's just because that was the environment when the WTO was created. But of course, we live in a very different world now. Now the WTO needs a lot of reform. So as the WTO is being reformed anyhow, maybe we could throw something about preventing countries from limiting their exports in the new rules. Another idea is we've learned the demand for grains and oil seeds for biofuels and animal feed outstrips demand for food pretty significantly. And so if we're worried about a food security crisis, maybe we can find some alternatives for biofuels and animal feed. Now that is directly linked to climate change. And so that gets into a much thornier, bigger issue, but finding alternatives and then having governments and maybe even central banks subsidize the development of those alternatives, particularly for biofuels, I think. So other renewables could help alleviate any food insecurity that we have. There should be a big push for research and development. There always has been. There are a number of things that could help in a structural way, could help limit food insecurity globally. One is we need to generate circular systems so that you can take waste and use it as fertilizer and feed to address the issue I just mentioned. And so that could help. We've made some progress in that, but we're not really there yet. So more R&D and innovation could help. Also innovation to reduce land and pesticide and fertilizer and water use. So using more data in order to figure out what the optimal mix is, particularly around fertilizer, given it's so scarce and also dear, so very expensive. That could certainly help. Research around alternative proteins could help as well. I would say it's not just developing these new innovations, but it's also having them spread out and widely used. And I think that's pretty difficult in some regions of the world. So having expertise as part of food aid programs more than just food aid, I think would be important as well. Now, how could we boost research and development? Financing always helps. And so engaging the private sector in trying to finance some of this innovation would be great. We've actually seen there's been a huge jump in private sector capital going into agri-food tech projects. So the increase last year in 2021 over 2020 was 85%. So a lot of money has flowed into this, but it's perhaps unsurprising that most of that has flowed into luxury goods and services. So a lot of the development has been around kind of online shopping and grocery delivery, which makes sense straight off the back of a pandemic. But if we could generate incentives, either with the tax code or with rates in terms of lending from banks and ultimately central banks, for some of this money to be funneled into addressing not luxury goods and services. So some projects that would actually help alleviate food insecurity, I think that would be helpful as well. And then the final point I want to make is mostly focused on the US as a food aid provider. That's largely because the US is the biggest food aid provider. The US provides around 65% of global food aid. And I would say that no country has this nailed, but the US has a few real fundamental issues that I think makes American food aid much less effective than it could be. One is that the US provides a lot of in-kind food aid. So a lot of the food and shipping, bagging, all has to come from the US. And it means that, earlier this year, we spent, I think, $383 million in order to deliver around $250 million in food. So we're spending much more than the value of the food, which isn't particularly efficient. The system benefits a lot of stakeholders in the US. And so I would say there are entrenched vested interests. First of all, the agribusiness companies in the US are benefiting from this. It's highly concentrated industry. So just a handful, roughly 3 companies are getting a lot of these contracts from the government to provide food aid. So, there is an argument that that's going to US farmers and that's really helping, the economy in the US. That's not really true. It's mostly benefiting just a handful of companies. Shippers in the US are benefiting a lot as well. There's some research suggesting that around 40% of US food aid programs are paid to the shippers only. And then NGOs actually benefit pretty significantly because they can take the food aid and sell it on the market, monetize it, so that they can use the money to pay for other programs as well. So that's not necessarily benefiting the end users we're trying to benefit. So providing less in-kind food aid and more cash, I think, is better. Providing only cash can be problematic, particularly if your monitoring isn't finely tuned, and then there are opportunities for corruption and inefficiencies. But if you can find the right mix between in-kind food aid and cash aid, I think that would improve the food security crisis globally. And so we certainly need to move more towards providing cash and also the expertise in monitoring to go along with it. I'll leave my thoughts there.
Thanks very much, Megan. Absolutely fascinating discussion. Really interesting to put the current food crisis in its historical perspective. And I found those comments on trade policy particularly interesting. I'm sure we're going to have more discussion towards the end of today's webinar about the policy implications and the role of trade policy, both at a unilateral and multilateral level. And so now I'm going to hand over to our final speaker, Máximo. Handing over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Give me a second. Okay. So I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, that looks terrific.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is to try to bring some historical perspective, but also some hypothesis of the way we can resolve the problem. Why? Because the problem we are facing today is a problem that is not new. It's something that we have been facing the last years, especially during the last 5 years. There has been an increase in chronic undernourishment, and the major drivers in order are conflict, followed by climate, by slowdowns and downturns, and COVID-19 play a huge role through economic slowdowns and downturns. And the consequences still are there, and we can talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, the third one is climate variability that affects in 2 dimensions, not only in the extremes, so extreme temperatures and a lot of water, like what happened in Pakistan, but also variability, which makes more difficult when it's excessive to make choices for farmers, and that creates a loss in terms of efficiency. And all this has affected the cost of affordability of healthy diets and is under poverty and inequality. Now, the issue of the COVID-19 consequence on slowdowns and downturns is something that we are still living. Many of the expansionary policies that were put by developed countries, of course, have affected developing countries. And right now, the issue of inflation is affecting developing countries, because the way to reduce inflation when you have a hype in savings, in liquidity, and of course a fiscal push in demand is to increase interest rates. And the problem in the US, which is historically the highest in terms of the liquidity that they have right now, will require that the interest rate will need to keep going up for more than a year, because they have the problem of wages, which will continue to feed into increases in prices. And that, of course, will create exchange rate devaluations for net importing countries, plus will increase the cost of debt and interest rates within those countries. So the consequences will continue. So the issue of COVID-19 has been extremely serious. And in terms of numbers, if we look at the increasing hunger in the last 2 years, up to now in 2021, the number of chronic undernourished people is 128 million people. And the increase of the last 2 years because of COVID-19 has been 150 million more people. And it has increased in all regions of the world, but even has increased in regions that were not supposed to increase and were supposed to be more resilient, like the case of Latin America. And the reason why it increased so much in Latin America was because of the informality and the mistakes taken in terms of policies to control COVID-19, which diluted the income of an informal sector, which was not poor, and is starting to convert that sector into a poor sector because they basically liquidate all the working capital. Now, and this is reflected in the FAO hunger map, which basically shows that, of course, the subjects that we expect in sub-Saharan Africa, especially the landlocked countries, are the ones, the darker the color, the worse you are in terms of percent of total population that have chronic hunger. But also you see Andean countries are facing significant challenges, of course, Central America, even Mexico, and as always, South Asia. Now, the point I am going to make is that the agricultural sector is a sector that lives under risk and uncertainties. And therefore, the way we have to operate in this sector is different than the way we have been operating in this sector. It will have to be a way in which look at the sector as a sector where it's contingent on what happens in every state of the world. So if the state of the world has weather shocks because of climate change, like what we are observing in Pakistan now, it will have an effect, because Pakistan is the fourth exporter in the world of rice, and therefore that will have an effect in terms of prices and in policy response of countries like what has happened in India with the export restrictions they have put up. So we need to understand that, and we need to operate under that dimensionality and look more at options rather than looking at deterministic ways of operating this sector. So we have developed the risk in 3 blocks. The humanitarian, of course, is emergencies, and that's something that we need to be prepared. But even in the humanitarian sector, we believe that we need to move more out of cash transfers and try to figure out a set of tools that will allow people moving into crisis or being close to IPC 3 or above the crisis classification, to have enough tools in their hands to be able to cope with this situation, to make them more resilient. And that's a very complex issue, because we are talking of situations where households are extremely budget constrained, live in very vulnerable environments. They are basically vulnerable to all these weather shocks and to slowdowns and downturns. So how we can create this tool set that they can use so that they can switch activities or they can switch commodities with the little they produce for subsistence to be able to cope with this, I think, is a big challenge, and we are working on that right now. The second group is the macro issues, and the macro issues outside of the debt and the growth and exchange rate that I was explaining before, where basically policies of developed countries will affect developing countries because of the monetary dominance. There is also new linkages that we didn't have seen before, like the linkage now with energy, especially natural gas, with the production of nitrogen and the production of fertilizers. And that is something that is not only because of Ukraine, it will also in the future. If I'm going to change the energy mix because to avoid emissions for climate change issues, that will affect, now we know it will affect the production of fertilizers, and that will affect food. So we need to understand the consequences of any of those, and those are what we call trade-offs, which are important. And there also, of course, the risk of nuclear contamination, which any spread of nuclear residuals over the land will mean that that plot of land will be out of production for 10 years or more. So that's something to take into account. And in the agricultural sector per se, we have the input issues, the logistical issues that were very sensitive during COVID-19 and show vulnerabilities in terms of logistics, which we saw part of that in 2007, 2008. But with COVID-19, they were really open and very clear, and that's something that we have to keep improving. The sensitivity of trade and policy responses and how countries overreact to situations, and where AMIS, as Joe was explaining, could play a crucial role. And also the issue of diseases, no? Like right now in Ukraine, there is African swine fever. If there is no control of the mobility of livestock, could create and could expand that to other countries. And that, of course, will have a correlate on production and prices. And all this is happening under water stress and climate change. So again brings up the topic of these vulnerabilities. So when we talk about resilience, and I am only going to talk to one dimension of resilience, which is what we call the resilience on food supply. And we have developed an index called the Dietary Sourcing Flexibility Index for kilocalories. Basically, we are looking at countries, how they can diversify the food sources in different ways, and how effective they can be. So we look at several dimensions. One is how much of the imports and trade with different parties. And the other dimension is how much I can produce and the diversity of domestic production. But we also have the size of the stocks that I have, which could also serve as a buffer in case of a shock. So if a country moves on the diagonal, basically they will have a bigger absorptive capacity to a shock rather than if they're in the origin. And if we look at this in the world, basically what we observe is that high-income countries for sure have bigger absorptive capacity. They are more diversified in both dimensions. There are some countries in Africa that are okay and others that are really bad, the majority, no? But again, according to the income level, we move closer to the origin. So that means that we are not having that level of resilience for absorptive capacity. And I think this was very evident during the war in Ukraine, because many countries were importing more than 80% of their grain from these two countries, from Russia Federation and Ukraine, which goes against any logic of having a diversified portfolio, any logic of having this uncertainty and risk concept in the way you strategize in case of this type of shocks, which sometimes you can predict them, sometimes you cannot. Now, why is this so important? Because historically, we know that the concentration of market of the exports of cereals is highly concentrated. This is what is happening today in terms of some major commodities, especially maize and wheat, where Russian Federation and Ukraine represent 30% of the exports. So if something happens to them, you remove 30% of the market and of the exports in the market, and then of course will have an increase in price. And this has evolved, this has changed over time. This is just a graph showing from the 1990s to 2019. And you will see that basically the US and the EU reducing 7 million metric tons of trade. But the bigger change was the increase that is happening in Russia and Ukraine, where there was an increase in 66 million metric tons. And there was also a significant decrease, similar size, in terms of Africa and Asia. So basically, we rotate from a set of countries that were key exporters to others, but we remain in like the top 4 or 5 that are the biggest exporters, control basically 70 or 80% of the exports in the world. Something that happens to them, everything blows up. And the presence of countries having such a level of dependency on imports, like you can see here, 50 countries more than 30% and 30 of those more than 60%, shows how little absorptive capacity we had in terms of that dimension of resilience. Now, the good thing is that it's not only your absorptive capacity and how much you need to have predictive power to be able to have resilience, all the tools that Joe was explaining, but it's also that we need to be able to respond to this. And that's what we call the supply response. No? And the supply response during the war of Ukraine was good. Essentially, the gap in wheat was 3 million metric tons, in maize, more or less 8 million metric tons, which says that that's why prices were starting to fall even before the Black Sea Agreement. And that tells us that, yes, there is capacity to respond. But this is also problematic in the case of the trade issues and the policy responses. And again, bring back another element that we are not used to this type of scenarios because we immediately respond. And here we can observe in terms of calories traded, what happened in COVID-19. Initially, there was an intention to increase export restrictions. AMIS came out, showed that there was enough supplies, then immediately it went down. During the 2007-2008 crisis, the yellow, we have a significant increase, rise got exacerbated, then it went down. And during COVID and during the Ukraine war, we have seen a prolonged increase up to 17%, and then it started to fall under the situation in the previous crisis. And this is going to increase now with what we are observing because of the export restrictions of India in rice. And why is this so important is because if we look at the world and we look at the 9 food groups that we need, the darker here means that you don't have less of capacity of producing those 9 food groups. You will see that most of our countries in food crisis are countries that cannot have access to those 9 food groups. They cannot have availability of that produce, and they need trade. So trade is central to be able to achieve that. Consequence of all this is prices will change, will vary, or will increase, and we will have price spikes, or we will have excessive volatility, which are 2 different elements. No, one is the first moment, the second one is the second moment, the variance, and that's where we need to look carefully. Now, the other problem, which is linked to the macroeconomic dimension of the risks, is that yes, the Black Sea Agreement has a low mobility of vessels with grain, and that has improved the situation, and this is basically where it is going now. And as you can see, most of it goes not to the poorest countries, which are the ones that have the biggest food access problem, but goes to countries that are middle or high income countries. The good news is that 49% is food, 51% is feed. And the better news is that although not everything is going to the most needed countries, at least 5% is going to the low income countries, and 29% in terms of value is going to the lower middle income countries. The rest, of course, is going to the upper and high income countries. Now, this tells us that that type of a measure helped, but was not complete. It requires some support on countries that were the most vulnerable. The 62 countries that we are saying are the most vulnerable and are with balance of payments problems, and that they require support, financial support, to be able to move them out of the situation and be able to afford food. Because today the problem is of food access. Potentially next season will be of food access plus food availability if we don't resolve the problem of fertilizer. So, but again, this is telling us that there is a need to combine policies because there is this other type of risk that we need to find a way to cope. The story of fertilizers is similar to the story of the cereals. Highly concentration. The bigger exporter of nitrogen is Russia, also of potassium, second on potassium, third of phosphorus. Significant dependency on imports of this country, and that's what we are observing today. The linkage between prices of natural gas, which were already increasing before the war, and they have exacerbated with the export restrictions from China, from Russian Federation, and the problems of Belarus in terms of the sanctions. That has exacerbated the situation, and prices keep going up, and therefore affordability is going down, and the USAID also published how the margins are reduced. And this is also followed by a problem of EU fertilizer imports from Russia are going down, but not only that, many plants of EU are closing because of the increase in natural gas, despite EU was before a significant exporter of nitrogen. And the consequence of that is that we will be facing a challenge in the EU because the major imports that they need from nitrogen are significantly reduced, as you can see in this graph. But in the case of the exports from Russia, they seem to stabilize now, and they seem to be increasing, which means that some big countries are being able to procure, given that they are not officially part of the sanctions, and there are mechanisms to do it despite of the sanctions in the SWIFT. The story of Belarus is affected more, although they export a lot before the sanctions, but now we are feeling the effect. And this will have an effect. And again, it will have an effect on the most vulnerable as always. And this is just a calculation done together with IFPRI to try to see what will be the impact in the supply gap using a tracker that we have developed on what is remaining to be imported on fertilizers. So we will have in bigger exporting countries like Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, some challenges, but in the smaller countries that use very little fertilizer, they are not going to have access because of the affordability problem. So the little they produce with little fertilizer will be even worse, and that's why you have the worst situation in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in the future, what we expect is that the production in Ukraine will reduce around 37%, the exports in an equivalent way, and the reduction of production, 15% of the land is because of the conflict, the remaining is because of switching crops to sunflower, and therefore this will have a correlate in the exports. So unless we have a supply response, we will cover that, and that should be more or less okay. but it depends on what happened with the fertilizer prices and how that will affect the future supply for the next planting season. So what to do here? So for us in the short term, basically we have to do humanitarian. We need to think a little bit different in the future on how to do humanitarian. We are doing right now, for example, support to producers so that they can keep doing certain activities, because with one planting season, they can support themselves for 12 months, which is very costly in terms of transfers just of cash or food. But we need to do it in a way that we don't create any distortion. But then we have the problem of the balance of payments. And there is no mechanism right now to be able to support countries that have huge debt levels, huge problems of balance of payments. They are food net importers, and they cannot access to food. So for those, we are proposing the food import financing facility, which is adapted to the mechanism of Bretton Woods that has the IMF, which is the balance of payment mechanism support that they have. Why we believe is essential is basically to minimize the problem of food access for the most vulnerable people, to minimize them following into a food crisis, and of course, to minimize the correlate of social unrest, which will be more costly. And there are mechanisms by which this can be done in a smooth way with a little cost. Right now, we are talking of an increase in the food import bill of $25.4 billion and affecting 1.72 billion people. So we need to find a solution for that in the short term. That's immediate to avoid a bigger cost in the future. But there are bigger challenges that we need to touch to increase this resilience. First is we need to keep trade open, and that's measures like the ones we're mentioning with WTO, but we need to find a way to accelerate the process of information to minimize potential risk of trade restrictions. Second, we need to increase transparency, and AMIS is playing the role of information, but we need to increase efficiencies in the use of fertilizers. And for that, we are deploying nutrition soil maps with the support of US government. We have now $20 million to do in three countries, but the idea is to scale it up. Because what we found is that people were using packages that not necessarily were the blending that they need. And Ethiopia was a good example in how to resolve that. So we need to accelerate that process, which will benefit in the future, will make it more resilient, because you will be using your resources in a more efficient way. But reduction of food loss and waste is another primer. Why we cannot reduce the 30% loss and waste is something that we need to, especially on the waste end, is something that can be done, and is something that will increase the supply, will increase access to healthy diets, and will be helpful. And one element which we found also is important is to have process of more real-time targeting, because in COVID-19, what happened is that there were new hotspots of food insecurity, and the cash transfer mechanism through the social protection programs in place were not responding to the new hotspots of food insecurity. So a lot of the money was given to people that were okay despite of the COVID-19, and not to people that were really changing their status of poverty. And of course, you have to reconstruct countries like the case of Ukraine. But that's not enough, no? Then we need to think more carefully on how to use technology and human capital, develop human capital, and especially to build institutions so that we can implement type of portfolio of policies. Because what we have seen is that the systems are interrelated, energy and food, health and food, and there are many interlinkages that we need to find ways to bring a package to those type of solutions that will allow us to build this portfolio of choices to try to operate under risk and uncertainty. So let me stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Máximo. Fascinating presentation, really, really interesting set of data there, and also very wide-ranging discussion of the policy options and issues facing us. So I think that's really fantastic, and to set up a general discussion and Q&A. So let me thank all three speakers this afternoon for just terrific presentations, and all being bang on time in terms of timing. So we've got some time for questions and discussion, which is terrific. So I just wanted to sort of start off the discussion. We've got a question in Q&A, and so please, if you have additional questions, please put them into the Q&A so I can ask them to the panelists. But I just wanted to start a little bit on some of the income distributional points that you mentioned towards the end of your talk, Máximo. So one of the things that's one of the sort of striking challenges of the current crisis and current food insecurity is there's an income distributional component across countries. And namely that sometimes the poorest countries are those that are least able to cope with the shock, as Máximo was making. But then also within countries, there's of course also the income distributional consequence. Even in relatively developed countries, it's those who are at the bottom of the distribution who are most exposed to food price shocks, in particular food price increases, because of course food is a bigger share of consumer expenditure if you're at the bottom of the distribution. So I wonder if you had any thoughts as to how, as to possible mechanisms to both support those at the bottom of the distribution within countries who may be most placed in crisis of rising food prices, and then also internationally, what are the right forums to try to help some of the most vulnerable countries cope with food price increases, and how can we improve current sort of international mechanisms for making transfers to countries that are particularly adversely affected by food price shocks. I don't know if any of the three of you who would like to go first, or in terms of sort of issues and potential options in responding to both of those distributional challenges.
So if you allow me, I will briefly touch it, but look, I think it's easier to do it within countries than between countries, because today, what will be the best policy globally will be that the interest rate of the US is not increased. And tell me if that will be possible. That's impossible, not? So, because that is creating a big problem to other countries because of devaluation and so on. But it's needed in the US because, of course, you need to lower the inflation. But it was because of a mistake done in the US, which was an excess liquidity during the COVID-19. Within countries, the evidence that we have is that building infrastructure essentially helps to reduce inequalities. That there are papers about it showing that, and I think the important thing is how you target the best possible infrastructure development so that you can reduce inequalities, and that applies to hard infrastructure, but also through value chain infrastructure. So that would be my post. It's very difficult to see really countries implementing policies for inequality, for reduction of inequality. But that's something that where infrastructure and digital technologies could play a crucial role. So I stop there.
Anybody else like to comment on that?
Yeah, I guess I'd highlight there are programs like SNAP, which used to be food stamps in the US, for example, which are means tested. And I guess having it be means tested is the crucial piece so that you can target lower income families as food prices go up. And I would agree that it's really difficult to do it globally. I mean, look at the developed world's pledges for financing and financial aid along the kind of COP meetings where the developed world has pledged a load of money and has delivered, I think less than half of it. And so the enthusiasm for actually executing on that for another global issue like climate change is so lukewarm. I think it would be hard to generate it for food security. That's why I was suggesting, when you're not facing a crisis, maybe everybody sitting around the table and setting up automatic stabilizers so that it isn't a political decision. It doesn't matter if the government's changed. If there is a particular trigger, then food aid gets distributed. But again, that's going to be difficult to agree.
Let me just follow up on that. I mean, I think there is a mechanism certainly for food aid, and that's World Food Program. I mean, there are other humanitarian aid things too. And I would agree with the criticism Megan leveled against a lot of the US food aid programs, because they tend to be tied to US purchases, in-kind purchases. You have restrictions to ship on US bottoms or US ships. And so all that adds incredible costs. So it's very, very inefficient to do that. Far better to get it in the hands of something like World Food Program that can source locally, can get things where it's needed in the fastest possible way. In terms of safety net programs, yes. And again, food stamps or the SNAP program, has ballooned over the last couple of years because of the economic downturn and the fact that so many families were adversely affected. But all the evidence suggests that it's done a very, very good job in terms of helping those households. So I think that is very important. And that's a very key thing for safety net programs to be targeted. Because I think if you look at countries like Egypt and others that have had broad-based programs to keep bread prices low, for example, a lot of those benefits end up slipping to families who can well afford higher food prices. And I think it just tends to be a far more inefficient way.
Thanks very much to all three of you. Really, really, really interesting. And then I thought one point that all three of you made was about monitoring and improving systems for monitoring and detecting shocks and tracking them in real time. And that relates to a question in the Q&A from Sonal Pandey, who says that he's currently working on a project called AI Lead Supply Chain Operations in the Food Industry. And his question is, do you see scope for artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms in terms of enhancing our ability to measure supply chains and assess their resilience? And I think that actually sort of connects with a bigger initiative. I think the current Biden administration has an initiative called the Flow Database, which is trying to measure the sort of supply chain goods moving through the US economy and resiliency and how easily to detect bottlenecks for the flow of goods through the US economy, not just in the agricultural sector, but more broadly, just trying to develop better data about what does the US supply chain look like, what are its bottlenecks. And so clearly there are a number of initiatives in that area. I wonder whether any of you had any kind of thoughts as to how we can improve our ability to measure and monitor global supply chains in food, to assess their resilience, a bit like stress testing for banks, for example, to try to assess where are the potential bottlenecks, and could there be a role for artificial intelligence, machine learning, relating to Sonal's question. I don't know whether any of you would like to sort of comment on that set of issues.
I can talk about it. Before that, I just want to say that I will agree absolutely with what Joe and Megan was saying in terms of the social protection programs. But the problem up to now that I have not seen many social protection programs where you have graduation. And that's why inequalities are not reduced. But in any case, so let me say, but on the artificial intelligence, there is a lot of work now being done on this. We have here a data lab that is working in several mechanisms to try to automatize things and to try to learn machine learning procedures. So I think it will be extremely useful for early warning tools that Joe was referring to, because you have massive amounts of data and massive amounts of dimensionalities of different factors. No? So here in FAO, we have 12 units that generate early warning elements. So on zoonotic diseases, on climate extremes, on prices, on volatility, and so on. How to combine those is really complex. And that's where powerful machines and machine learning could help enormously to have early warning systems that have finally some predictive power, which today we don't have.
Yeah, let me follow on with that, because I think Máximo in his presentation showed our export restriction tracker that my colleague David Laborde at IFPRI has put together and pioneered. And there we are scraping data actively, because it's just very difficult. The WTO has a reporting process where WTO members are supposed to report anytime they put on export restrictions. That takes time. Oftentimes countries don't report. But on the other hand, if you have like what we're using, sort of scraping news reports and government reports and notifications saying there's, Kazakhstan, for example, just took its export restrictions off wheat and wheat flour, and that popped up immediately. We were able to modify our trackers, so to give something much better real time. I think that's only going to improve, and that's just a very crude use of machine learning. I mean, I think to actually get more insights, I think that will come, and we're certainly, I think we're getting way ahead of where we were 30 years ago, where it was, a survey here or a survey there.
And then we also have a question from Ilyana Kuziemko as well, who asked that the 2008 to 2012 food crisis has been linked to political instability, as I think Mega mentioned, and in particular the Arab Spring. And Ilyana's question is, do you think we're going to see a repeat of that political instability? And if so, which countries do you think have regimes that are most likely to face the risk of toppling through something like the Arab Spring? I don't know, would anybody like to comment on that?
I'll take a quick shot, but I remember that it wasn't just food prices that caused these riots during the Arab Spring. I mean, they all had political issues that were long seated and bubbling up, and this was, the food prices were pretty much the spark that set these things off. And I think you certainly have already seen it here with, we had issues with Sri Lanka again. And Máximo said this as well. We're coming off of several 2 or 3 years now of COVID, where government resources have been drawn down for many poor countries. And so trying to meet these additional demands of high food prices, other sorts of things, Sri Lanka ends up not importing very much fertilizer and had all sorts of problems with productivity issues because of some climate issues as well. All that contributes. And I think that clearly, anywhere you look where there or other political problems, having an inflation rate on food that is double digit and climbing is a good recipe for unrest.
I think, Megan, did you want to respond there as well?
Yeah, sure. I was also going to highlight Sri Lanka, but it's a good example both in that, Sri Lanka is pretty idiosyncratic. The government decided to make the country organic before Russia invaded Ukraine. So there was already an issue with fertilizer, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and fertilizer got even more expensive. And also the government decided to engage in generous tax cuts just before the pandemic, when they then, lost their revenues, but had to spend a lot on a pandemic response. That being said, food insecurity doesn't help those kinds of environments where other things are a little bit unstable. I think Peru, Pakistan have also had a little bit of social unrest as well. So I wouldn't take the analogy so far. I wouldn't say we're going to see another Arab Spring, certainly. But if you already have issues in a country and then food prices spike, that tends to exacerbate them. So I think we could see some parallels.
Thanks.
Let me just add and give you another example of the way you can use artificial intelligence. So for this exactly, we have developed this tool that tracks every day any messages of social unrest. So, and contradictorily, this is mostly in South America, which is where many of the problems are happening right now because of the problem of informality.
That looks fascinating. It's a really interesting use of data and kind of web scraping and in real time to kind of see social unrest appearing. That's really, really interesting. And then we had another question from Yu Yang, who sort of touches on a point that a number of you made. So Yu Yang in particular asks about contributors to the high shipping costs relative to the value of goods for food aid distributed from the US. And I think this connects with some of the earlier discussion about the Jones Act and so on. And I guess one interesting question here is one response to the supply side pressures of increasing food prices would be to try to improve the supply side of the economy, right? And in particular, to improve the efficiency of distribution networks. And for the US, I think one of you mentioned the Jones Act, which restricts US shipments to be on US registered shipping and contributes towards higher shipping costs for US distributed goods. And I wonder if any of you had any kind of broader thoughts as to how we might try to improve the supply chain and alleviate some of the supply chain bottlenecks. So for example, as we all know, container prices from Shanghai to the west coast of the US increased by an order of magnitude during the pandemic. As another kind of example of it takes time to build ships, it takes time for supply chains to adjust to shocks. But do any of you have any thoughts as we, based on Yu Yang's question as to how we could try to improve the supply chain and lower the cost of food through reductions in transportation costs? I know that's a big question, so I don't know.
Yeah. One thing I want to at least clarify is, although I think Jones Act has all sorts of problems for the very reasons you've talked about. The food aid thing actually isn't Jones Act. Jones Act is shipping within, between U.S. ports. That requires American bottoms. These are cargo preference laws that are separate and are part of the sort of food aid legislation in the US. But again, same effect. So I agree 100% with the sentiment. Interesting, for agriculture, and Máximo can comment on this as well, but, bulk trade actually did pretty well during COVID. So, shipments of wheat and corn and rice and barley and all those had far less problems than containerized shipments, where those were started to get caught up in the West Coast problems, in Long Beach, but also all the way up to the Pacific Northwest, and there, so high value crops like almonds and other sorts of things, which actually had benefited from essentially backhauls from China. So China's shipping a lot of stuff to the US. They have to get those containers back to China. So you get really cheap rates. And so, almonds and other agricultural products out of California in particular were able to take advantage of that. And that, of course, all started to change because essentially with a lot of the delays in the West Coast ports, what would happen is China wanted those containers back as soon as possible. So they were shipping them back empty and so a lot of these agricultural problems, I think that has been a very big issue. And I think that, the outdated port facilities and other things on the West Coast really do need to be really rethought. And these are a lot of these infrastructure in the US, particularly on the shipping side, is just, you haven't seen much modernization there over several years. So,
just to add, I fully agree with Joe. We have not stress test infrastructure capacities, and I think COVID-19 was very useful, at least for us, because we saw the type of problems at the beginning that could be resolved, and then we saw the type of problems when the demand was boosted back, and that was the container issue that Joe. So again, this type of shocks helps to understand where the hotspots are of bottlenecks, and we need to learn from those and work more on those, because we were, like FAO didn't have a logistic analysis unit, and that's something that now we are at least starting to have.
Yeah, I just add that, some of the solutions are high tech. They involve, data analysis and machine learning to improve efficiencies. Some of them are really low tech. So during the pandemic, Flexport, a logistics management company, set up a taco truck in the port in LA and spent all night just talking to truckers and dock workers, asking what the problem was. And it turned out there were a lot of really easy problems to fix once someone had told you about them. So there were, limits on how high you could stack containers that had been established decades ago and made no sense, which meant that there were backlogs. So you could change that. Truckers were saying that, the ports were only open during the day. And so in LA, when there's loads of traffic, no trucker was able to make their slot. And so, you could extend the hours of the port. So some of the solutions are really high tech, some are pretty low tech. And I would say broadly in the US in particular, our ports are held together by bubble gum and duct tape. And I suspect that that's not unique to the US at all, actually. I think that's probably a global issue.
Thanks very much to all three of you. That really, really interesting discussion there. And I think we've got time for one more question. So again, Ileana has a really interesting question. So one of the features of recent years has been this sort of return to protection, and more broadly, a kind of rise of geopolitical tensions between, in particular, the United States and China, leading to debates about, for example, decoupling and so on of the US economy from China and its wider global implications. And so some of that debate is about sort of, say, semiconductors in particular, or high-tech sectors. But then also more broadly, one could ask a question about what are the implications of that potential decoupling, rising geopolitical tensions. And of course, now it's not just China, US, it's also Russia, West, Russia, China, how those geopolitical relationships are going to develop. And so Ileana's question is, what are the implications of that for global food supply chains? And will developing countries, for example, start to have to choose between, say, the United States and China? And will there be a wider geopolitical implication of that for the resiliency of agricultural supply chains? Again, I know that's a really kind of big picture question, but I wonder if any of you have any thoughts on those wider, kind of more broadly, the implications of rising geopolitical tensions for food supply chains.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. And just in terms of the tensions themselves are quite troubling. As far as agriculture is concerned, it's very interesting. China's the #1 agricultural importer in the world, and that's something that has grown over time. But if you go down the list of all the major agricultural exporters in the world, China is #1 or #2 on everyone's list. I mean, it's just they buy from everyone. So all of this attention over phase 1 agreement, and the agricultural sector is one sector that did quite well under phase 1. But I have to tell you, if you look at Brazil's exports, if you look at Argentina's exports, if you look at Ukraine's exports, all of them did well over that same period in terms of selling stuff to China. China was buying a lot of product, both in terms of feed grains, both in terms of oil seeds, animal products, and so they've been a big integrator in the world. They're just everything. A lot of the world's food exports flow to China. And any sort of disruption in that, we can see back during the trade war what that meant. I mean, China half the year buys soybeans from the U.S. and then when the South American crop comes in, they turn to that. And to cut that off meant huge disruptions. I mean, China bought almost everything that was in Brazil in terms of soybeans, and U.S. ended up filling holes around the world. But it just is very disruptive and a cost to China consumers, obviously, to U.S. producers and others. So very disruptive.
I guess I would add that I'm just not buying the deglobalization narrative yet. I'm not totally convinced by it. There's no metric for globalization, unfortunately. So we have to kind of disaggregate it and look at other proxies. And if you look at those proxies, world trade to GDP, FDI flows, capital flows up until Russia invaded Ukraine, at least, you didn't actually see any evidence of deglobalization, but, you can imagine that globalization is happening much more slowly than before. So I think, the focus is more on resilience than efficiency. Certainly, I think that will be the case. And so we might see some regionalization of food markets, but I think it will be a question of, how can you get things in a cost-effective way with kind of a backup option. So as with all other, most other industries, I think there will be kind of global supply chains. I think they'll persist, but then there will be kind of an alternative supplier in case we get a shock. So a supply chain plus model. I think that will apply to food as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then I guess we're getting quite close on time now. So I thought maybe now is a good time if we have any closing comments, just reflecting on the discussion. And one thing I wanted to close on, I think all three of you made this point, is the sort of importance of trying to encourage countries to avoid introducing export restrictions and other constraints on food that not only contributes to price volatility and to the sort of global food crises. And so the sort of the importance of keeping trade open and maintaining open markets and all the gains that globalization can bring to countries, given that we know around the world agriculture is highly specialized, that different countries, some crops are produced in a relatively small number of countries, account for a large share of world exports. So for example, wheat and corn, as Máximo and others of you showed during your presentation. So for me, that's a kind of really key insight, is kind of the importance of maintaining open trade and avoiding trade policy restrictions contributing to the global crisis. But I don't know, did any of you have any other closing comments you'd like to make in terms of the overall discussion?
No, for me, only this issue of how to work under risk and uncertainties is really important for agriculture, and that's what we will be facing in the future. And it's not an easy issue, and it will require a lot of tools to be available to operate. So technology is helping. So the high-tech industry is helping because you can have better prediction of weather and switch very fast to other commodities. But for small farmers, which are the biggest in terms of quantity of farms, but not in terms of production, of course, for them, we need to find ways through which using technology to allow them to do also precision farming as through public goods, because they won't be able to afford it through private goods. So we need to find a way to achieve that so that they have better tools to cope with risks, which are pretty complex, right?
Thank you.
I guess, sorry, I just make one point that I forgot to make during my presentation, but I think it's important. It's just the role of markets in all of this, because what we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine, that a lot of money piled into commodity and agriculture ETFs. And so what you find with ETFs is that they tend to create a momentum trade. And so actually we saw food prices spike, but how much of that was based on fundamentals versus just some momentum moves in markets is an outstanding question. And I think more of it may be just momentum in markets than we appreciate. And if that is the case, then now as food prices are rising less quickly, at least, if they fall, you could end up getting a momentum trade in the other direction. And I would wait to see that happen before I can say with much confidence that it's probably a market play as well. but I do think it's not entirely based on fundamentals, and that's a new player. We don't really have any tools to fight against that, but it's worth considering that, you know, these price swings that affect so many people so significantly are also just because of momentum trading in the markets.
Yeah, this would be worth another session. I tend to discount that I mean, I do still think over time fundamentals rule these markets, and I can look at the price chart that we've seen over the last 6 months and pretty much trace when prices started to fall and tie that to economic phenomena in a given day. Absolutely, there's all sorts of fund activity and other sorts of things that can drive prices higher maybe than an equilibrium would suggest. My point, frankly, on all this would be, I would really like to see a return to negotiations, you know, in WTO and others in terms of improving market access, doing something about export restrictions, addressing trade distorting domestic support, you know, these sort of core issues that have been lingering. Now, you know, we came close in 2008 to getting some agreement, but since then it's really languished. Although significantly, we did have, the WTO did agree not to, or to ban the, or to prevent the use of export bans for food used for humanitarian purposes. And that's, you know, modest, but at least significant, I think, given the current crisis.
Thanks very much. Thank you. And just thank you again to all three of you for a really fantastic webinar this afternoon. It's been really, really interesting. I think we've covered such huge ground on this really, really important set of issues about food security, both here in the United States and for countries around the world. So thank you, Megan. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Máximo, for a really terrific discussion this afternoon. And I feel I've learned a lot, and it's just been fantastic having this conversation this afternoon. Thanks very much.